At 05:53 hours on October 5, 1943, Ensign Robert Duncan occupied the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat on the rain-soaked deck of the USS Yorktown. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he observed the aircraft ahead of him disappearing into the storm as they launched one by one. The mission objective was Wake Island, where Japanese fighters would certainly be positioned and ready. Duncan had never engaged in lethal combat. He was a 22-year-old from Marin, Illinois, a young man from a small town who had acquired his flying skills less than 2 years prior. His hands maintained their grip on the control stick, while his flight suit absorbed moisture from the rain sweeping across the deck. The engine's roar filled the air as the deck crew provided the launch signal. Duncan advanced the throttle, and the Hellcat's acceleration pressed him firmly into his seat as the aircraft accelerated down the deck and lifted into the black sky. The events that would unfold during the subsequent 30 minutes would signal the beginning of the end for the most formidable fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. The Zero's dominance. For 18 months, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had established a fearsome reputation among American pilots throughout the Pacific theater. From Pearl Harbor through the Philippines, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero had achieved superiority in virtually every aerial engagement. Its performance characteristics exceeded those of all American aircraft in operation. The Zero demonstrated superior speed, altitude capability, turning radius, and endurance compared to anything the Americans could field. Japanese engineers had accomplished something remarkable in aviation design. They had created a carrier-based fighter capable of outperforming land-based aircraft. The aircraft possessed such exceptional lightness and agility that it appeared to transcend conventional aerodynamic principles. The Zero achieved an impressive kill ratio of 12-1 against Chinese pilots before America's entry into the war. Over Rangoon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft in combat, destroying 27 while losing only a single aircraft. At Pearl Harbor, 78 Zeros provided escort for the bombers that inflicted devastating damage on the Pacific Fleet. 9 Zeros were shot down primarily by anti-aircraft fire, while the aircraft proved nearly invulnerable in air-to-air combat. American pilots developed a profound respect mixed with fear for the Zero. Official tactical doctrine remained straightforward and sobering. Avoid engagement when possible. If a Zero achieved a tailed position, the prescribed response was to dive away immediately. Pilots were explicitly instructed not to attempt turning engagements or climbing contests with the Zero. The strategy was survival through evasion, hoping that armor protection would hold and that carriers could be reached before the enemy closed the distance. The Wildcat's limitations. The Grumman F4F Wildcat served as the Navy's primary fighter when hostilities commenced. It earned a reputation for toughness and reliability, with pilots affectionately referring to it as a Grumman Ironworks product due to its robust construction. But the Wildcat could not match the Zero in speed, climb rate, or maneuverability. Wildcat pilots achieved survival through tactical innovation, primarily by operating in pairs and employing the Thatch weave, a defensive maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander Thatch that enabled wings to provide mutual protection. Survival represented a defensive posture rather than a path to victory, and by mid-1942, Navy leadership recognized the urgent need for superior equipment. The challenge facing American engineers was not a lack of knowledge regarding high-performance aircraft design. That expertise existed, as evidenced by the Vought 4U Corsair already under development, which would eventually become one of the war's finest fighters. The fundamental problem was that Navy planners lacked comprehensive understanding of their adversary. The Zero remained shrouded in mystery. Its performance specifications were classified, and its design philosophy was unknown to American intelligence. American pilots who survived encounters could describe its capabilities, but could not explain the engineering principles that achieved them. They could not identify weaknesses because they remained unaware that any existed. A fateful mission over the Aleutians. On June 4, 1942, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayushi Koga departed from the aircraft carrier Ryujo to conduct an attack on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. His mission formed part of a diversionary operation designed to redirect American attention away from the main Japanese offensive toward Midway Island. Koga and his wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsugu Shikada, executed their attack on Dutch Harbor and strafed American positions. During the engagement, Koga's Zero sustained ground fire damage, resulting in an oil leak from the engine. The aircraft remained airworthy, but could not sustain flight for an extended period. Koga turned toward Aleutian Island, approximately 20 miles east of Dutch Harbor, where the Japanese had designated an emergency landing area. A submarine waited offshore to retrieve any downed pilots. From the air, the landing strip appeared suitable, long grass covering flat terrain, seemingly perfect for a wheels-down landing. The fatal landing. Appearances proved deceptive. Beneath the grass lay a bog, with soft mud concealed by the vegetation. When Koga lowered his landing gear and touched down, the wheels immediately sank into the marsh. The Zero inverted and slid to a halt in the bog. The impact broke his neck, and he died instantly at 19 years of age. He would never know the profound impact his death would have on the course of the war. His wingmen circled overhead, bound by orders to destroy any downed Zero to prevent capture by enemy forces. This represented standard operating procedure, but they could not confirm with certainty that Koga had perished. The canopy remained intact, and the aircraft appeared undamaged aside from its inverted position. Unable to bring themselves to strafe their comrade, they circled twice, hoped for his survival, and returned to their carrier. The Zero remained in the bog, inverted, but largely intact. It sat undisturbed for 5 weeks, while rain fell and Aleutian fog enveloped it. Birds landed on its upturned belly, and no one came. Discovery and recovery. On July 10th, a Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane piloted by Lieutenant William Tess conducted a flight over the Aleutians when his crew chief, machinist-mate Albert Knack, observed something unusual below. A gray shape in the marsh on Aleutian Island. They descended beneath the clouds for a closer look. It was an aircraft bearing Japanese markings, even visible through the mud. Tess transmitted a radio report of the sighting. Within days, a salvage team arrived on the island. They discovered Koga's body still in the cockpit and buried him nearby with military honors. Subsequently, they commenced the challenging work of extracting the Zero from the mud. The recovery operation proved difficult as the bog resisted yielding its prize. Equipment had to be transported to the site, and the aircraft required careful elevation to prevent additional damage. The process consumed weeks, but by early August, the Zero was on board a ship bound for San Diego. Navy mechanics at North Island worked continuously on the recovered aircraft. The damage proved surprisingly minimal. The tail required straightening, wing tips needed repair work, the propeller required repairs, and the landing gear had to be rebuilt. However, the engine remained intact, the airframe was fundamentally sound, and the flight controls functioned properly. Within weeks, they had produced a flyable Zero. On September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the restored aircraft and took off for the first of 24 test flights. He flew the aircraft for 25 consecutive days, pushing it to its operational limits, measuring its performance, and documenting every characteristic. The discoveries Sanders made during those flights would fundamentally alter the course of the war. The Zero was not invincible. It represented a brilliant design built around a critical compromise. The Japanese had sacrificed everything for performance. No armor plating protected the pilot. No self-sealing material lined the fuel tanks. The airframe was light to the point of structural fragility. A concentrated burst of .50 caliber fire would cause the aircraft to disintegrate. A fuel tank fire provided the pilot with no chance of survival. Exploitable weaknesses. Sanders identified specific weaknesses that American pilots could exploit. Above 200 knots, the Zero's roll rate became extremely difficult to move, with control forces increasing dramatically at high speed. At 250 knots, the aircraft could barely execute roll maneuvers. The aircraft rolled more readily to the left than to the right, likely due to propeller torque effects. The engine's float-type carburetor would cease functioning under negative acceleration, meaning that if a Zero attempted to follow an American aircraft into a steep dive, its engine would sputter and fail. These weaknesses were not merely theoretical observations, but represented exploitable tactical opportunities. An American pilot possessing this knowledge could escape a Zero in pursuit. He could dive away at high speed, accelerating past 200 knots where the Zero's roll rate deteriorated. He could execute a hard roll to the right, forcing the Zero to perform its weaker maneuver. He could push into negative G-force, temporarily cutting his own engine, but knowing the Zero's engine would cut out as well, and for a longer duration. Disseminating critical intelligence. The information obtained from the Akutan Zero was compiled into comprehensive technical reports distributed throughout the fleet. Intelligence Summary 59, Technical Aviation Intelligence Brief Number 3, and Tactical and Technical Trends Number 5. Pilots committed the findings to memory. Dive away, roll right, employ negative G-force maneuvers, do not attempt turning engagements, do not engage in climbing contests, exploit the identified weaknesses. However, a significant challenge remained. The intelligence from the Akutan Zero arrived too late to influence the design of America's next major fighter aircraft. That aircraft was already conducting flight operations. The Hellcats' development. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been under development since before Pearl Harbor. Throughout early 1942, Leroy Grumman and his chief designers, Jake Swearble and Bill Schwindler, had been collaborating with the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics to develop a replacement for the Wildcat. They understood that the new fighter required greater size, speed, and power. They knew it needed superior climb performance and faster roll rates. They knew it needed to protect its pilots with armor and self-sealing tanks. What they initially lacked was precise performance data on the Zero's capabilities. They possessed only the reports of pilots who had engaged it and survived. Input from combat veterans. Those pilots began returning home and sharing their experiences. On April 21, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Butch O'Hare received the Medal of Honor at the White House in Washington, D.C. O'Hare had become a national hero 2 months earlier when he single-handedly attacked 9 Japanese Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, threatening the aircraft carrier Lexington. His wingman's weapons had malfunctioned, and the rest of his flight was out of position. O'Hare was alone, but attacked regardless. In 4 minutes, he destroyed 5 bombers and damaged a 6th, disrupting the attack and saving the Lexington from certain damage and possible destruction. He accomplished this using only 60 rounds per kill, demonstrating marksmanship that amazed even experienced pilots. The Navy declared it one of the most daring individual actions in combat aviation history. President Franklin Roosevelt presided over the ceremony and asked O'Hare's wife Rita to place the medal around her husband's neck. Roosevelt then asked a question that would shape the future of American naval aviation. What did American pilots need most in a new fighter?
O'Hare responded without hesitation. A plane that would ascend faster, something with superior climb performance. The Grumman Visit. The following day, April 22, 1942, O'Hare visited the Grumman Aircraft Factory in Bethpage, Long Island, New York. He spent hours with the engineers, describing the realities of combat against the Japanese. He explained the Zero's climb rate, turning ability, and acceleration. He detailed the Wildcat's limitations, identifying where it fell short and where pilots felt most vulnerable. He conveyed precisely what American pilots needed to survive.
Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson from the Bureau of Aeronautics attended as well. He emphasized something O'Hare had demonstrated in his Medal of Honor action. Accurate targeting requires adequate visibility. The new fighter needed superior cockpit visibility, enabling the pilot to observe in all directions, including behind and below. Grumman listened carefully. They redesigned the cockpit, mounting it higher in the fuselage. They sloped the forward fuselage downward toward the engine cowling, providing the pilot with an unobstructed view over the nose. They enlarged the canopy and gave it a bubble configuration. The engine decision. 4 days after O'Hare's visit, the Bureau of Aeronautics made another decision that would significantly impact the war. They ordered Grumman to replace the planned engine with a more powerful alternative. The original design had specified a Wright R2600 Cyclone producing 1,700 horsepower. While it was a good engine, proven and reliable, it was insufficient. The new engine would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, producing 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. This was the same engine that powered the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt and the Navy's F-4U Corsair. It represented the most powerful engine available for American fighters, and Grumman was going to install it in their new aircraft. The decision necessitated significant redesign work. The airframe required strengthening to handle the additional power. The engine mount required rebuilding. The fuel system required upgrading. However, Grumman's engineers worked efficiently. They had been constructing aircraft for the Navy since 1931 and understood both the service's requirements and how to fulfill them. First flights. On June 26, 1942, the first prototype Hellcat, designated XF6F-1, took to the sky with test pilot Robert Hall at the controls. It flew adequately, but the 1,700 horsepower engine was clearly inadequate. The Navy wanted more. On July 30th, barely a month later, the redesigned prototype with the Double Wasp engine flew for the first time. The transformation was remarkable. The XF6F-3, as it was now designated, was 25% faster than the original design. It could climb at 3,300 feet per minute, faster than any American fighter before it. It reached a top speed of 375 miles per hour, and it could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. Built like a tank, the Hellcat was constructed with exceptional durability. 212 pounds of armor protected the cockpit and engine. Steel plates surrounded the pilot seat. A bullet-resistant windshield shielded him from frontal fire. The engine had its own armor protecting the oil cooler. Self-sealing fuel tanks would swell shut if punctured, preventing the catastrophic fires that had killed numerous Zero pilots. The wings spanned over 42 feet with 434 square feet of area, nearly a third larger than the Wildcats. That enormous wing area provided the Hellcat with exceptional lift and maneuverability for its size. It meant the aircraft could operate at lower speeds without stalling, and that carrier landings were easier and safer. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns protruded from the wings, 3 on each side. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute. Together, they could deliver nearly 80 rounds per second. A 2-second burst would send over 150 bullets downrange.
Against the unarmored Zero, this firepower was devastating. Design philosophy. Grumman built the Hellcat to be tough, simple, and easy to maintain. They built it to survive carrier operations, hard landings, rough handling, and the corrosive salt air of the Pacific. They built it to bring pilots home alive. Leroy Grumman's design philosophy was evident. Provide the pilot with every advantage. Protect him, arm him, allow him to survive his mistakes, and enable him to return to fight again. The first production F6F-3 rolled off the assembly line in October 1942. Grumman had constructed a new factory, Plant Number 3, specifically for Hellcat production. They encountered difficulty obtaining structural steel during wartime shortages, so they purchased scrap metal from the demolished 2nd Avenue Elevated Railway in New York City. A popular saying circulated that the steel had not gone into constructing the factory, but into manufacturing Hellcats. The aircraft were practically made of subway tracks. Entering service. By early 1943, the aircraft were reaching operational squadrons. Fighting Squadron 9 received the Hellcats in January. Butch O'Hare Squadron, now redesignated Fighting Squadron 6, received theirs shortly afterward. Training commenced immediately. By summer, the aircraft were heading to the Pacific. The Hellcats' first combat mission occurred on August 31, 1943, when aircraft from the carriers Yorktown, Essex, and Independence attacked Marcus Island, a Japanese outpost less than 1,000 miles from Tokyo. Commander Charles Croman led VF-5, Lieutenant Commander Piltori led VF-9, and a detachment of O'Hare's VF-6 participated as well. The early morning raiders caught the Japanese by surprise, destroying 8 twin-engine bombers on the ground. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, and 2 Hellcats went down, both to ground fire. One pilot crashed from engine trouble. However, no Hellcats were lost to Japanese fighters, because no Japanese fighters were present. The enemy had not anticipated an attack on Marcus, and the island garrison was stunned. The following day, over Howland and Baker Islands, Lieutenant Richard Loesch and Ensign A.W. Nyquist scored the Hellcats' first aerial victory when they cooperated to shoot down a Japanese Kawanishi H-8K Emily flying boat. The Emily was a large 4-engine reconnaissance aircraft, not a fighter. The kill did not prove the Hellcat could defeat the Zero. The true test would come 5 weeks later at Wake Island in the rain and darkness against the aircraft the Hellcat had been designed to destroy. The Wake Island engagement. Ensign Robert Duncan climbed through the storm clouds, his engine howling, his instruments barely visible in the pre-dawn blackness. He was part of a fighter sweep ahead of the main strike force. Their objective was to clear the sky of Japanese fighters before the bombers arrived. Duncan possessed advantages that pilots earlier in the war could only have imagined. His commanding officer, operations officer, and gunnery officer had all tested and flown the Akutan Zero. They had shared their knowledge with every pilot in the squadron. Duncan understood the Zero's weaknesses and knew how to exploit them. He was flying an aircraft designed from the ground up to defeat it.
Rain hammered against his canopy, and visibility was nearly zero. Duncan flew on instruments, trusting his training and the 1,800 horsepower engine pulling him through the clouds. The Hellcat climbed steadily, gaining altitude at a rate that would have astonished pilots just a year earlier. Then he emerged above the storm. The sky was clear, stars still glittered overhead, and the eastern horizon glowed with the first light of dawn. There, silhouetted against that glow, was a Japanese Zero. First kill. The Zero pilot had not detected him. Duncan possessed the advantage of position, surprise, and altitude. Everything a fighter pilot could desire. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The Hellcat accelerated faster than any aircraft Duncan had ever flown. The double Wasp engine roared. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 knots, past 350 knots, past 400 knots. The slipstream screamed past the canopy. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. Duncan squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted, and tracers reached across the sky, bright lines of fire in the pre-dawn darkness. The Zero disintegrated under the impact. Duncan observed pieces breaking away, saw the aircraft begin to tumble, saw it disappear below him trailing smoke. He pulled up and climbed back to altitude. 1 kill. His first. However, more Zeros were in the sky. Second kill. A legendary ace falls. Duncan spotted a second Zero below him, turning hard to engage another Hellcat. The Japanese pilot had not seen him diving toward him. He was focused on his target, committed to his attack. Duncan rolled into a dive, building speed and lining up the shot. At the last moment, the Zero pilot saw him approaching. He broke off his attack and pulled into a vertical climb, straight up, employing the Zero's legendary climb rate to escape. It was a tactic that had resulted in the deaths of dozens of American pilots. Japanese pilots had perfected this maneuver. Lure a Wildcat into a climbing fight. The Zero could outclimb anything in the American inventory. When the Wildcat stalled out and fell away, the Zero would roll over and dive down for the kill. Simple, deadly, and reliable. It had worked against Wildcats for 2 years. It had worked for this particular pilot, Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda, 9 times before. Sueda had 9 American kills to his name, 9 pilots who had made the mistake of attempting to climb with him. He had every reason to believe it would work again. However, Duncan was not flying a Wildcat. The Hellcat followed Sueda into the climb. Its 2,000 horsepower engine clawed at the sky. Its massive wings bit into the thin air. The aircraft did not stall. It did not fall away. It continued climbing, gaining on the Zero with every second. Sueda reached the top of his arc and rolled over, expecting to see the American fighter falling away below him, helpless and an easy kill. Instead, he saw the Hellcat directly behind him, climbing, gaining, guns coming to bear. Duncan pressed the trigger. The Hellcat bucked as 6 guns fired simultaneously. Tracers converged on the Zero. Sueda's aircraft came apart in midair. The fuselage separated from the wings. Fire erupted from the fuel tanks. Debris scattered across the sky. Duncan flew through the wreckage and continued climbing, searching for more targets. 2 Zeros destroyed in rapid succession. The first Hellcat kills against the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific for 18 months. One of those kills was a 9-victory ace, one of Japan's experienced combat pilots. The message was unmistakable. The Zero's reign was over. The word spread. News of Duncan's victory spread throughout the fleet. Pilots discussed it in ready rooms, in wardrooms, and on flight decks. The Hellcat could climb with a Zero. The Hellcat could kill a Zero. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. However, Duncan's engagement was merely the beginning. The Tarawa engagement. On November 23, 1943, Hellcats from multiple carriers engaged Japanese fighters over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The battle raged for 2 days as American forces assaulted the beaches below. In the sky above, Hellcats tore into Zero formations with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Junior Grade Ralph Hanks shot down 5 Zeros in 5 minutes, becoming an instant ace. Other pilots added to the tally. When the fighting concluded, American pilots claimed 30 Zeros destroyed. 1 Hellcat was lost. The kill ratio was 30-1. Over Rabaul on November 11, 1943, Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs fought running battles with Japanese aircraft throughout the day. Nearly 50 enemy aircraft were claimed destroyed. Rabaul, the Japanese fortress that had dominated the South Pacific for 2 years, was being systematically destroyed from the air. The Kwajalein engagement. On December 4, 1943, over Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, 91 Hellcats engaged 50 Zeros in one of the largest air battles of the Pacific War. The fighting was intense. with Zeros and Hellcats swirling through the sky in a massive engagement. When it concluded, the Americans had shot down 28 Zeros. They had lost 2 Hellcats. The ratio was 14-1. Something fundamental had changed. The Zero was no longer the hunter. It was becoming the prey. Japanese recognition of the shift. Japanese pilots noticed the shift almost immediately. Flight reports from late 1943 begin describing American fighters that behaved differently than before. They were more aggressive. They engaged in turning fights that would have been suicidal a year earlier. They climbed when attacked instead of diving away. They fought like pilots who knew they possessed the superior aircraft, because they did. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero at all altitudes. Above 14,000 feet, it could outclimb the Zero. Above 235 miles per hour, it could outroll the Zero. It could dive faster without structural damage. It could absorb punishment that would have destroyed the unarmored Japanese fighter.